The big story that we've been tracking here on the channel, a grand gesture for Russian President Vladimir Putin, where Prime Minister Modi today broke protocol to receive him at the Palam technical area. He, in fact, greeted Putin with a handshake, a warm embrace. Both of them left the airport together in the same vehicle. The Russian president, in fact, rode in the vehicle of the Indian PM. Remember, Prime Minister Modi is hosting a private dinner for Putin after his arrival in New Delhi. And on that, let me go straight across now to Ravi Agarwal, Editor-in-Chief of Foreign Policy Magazine, joining us now on NDTV. Ravi Agarwal, thanks very much for speaking to us. President Putin is in India soon after he had two very interesting men meeting him. What do you think he'll be telling Mr. Modi about that meeting today with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff? Or is that even on the table?
I don't know that he's necessarily going to pass on details that have been discussed with the United States about Ukraine with India. My guess is that what this summit is really about, first of all, it's an annual summit. It's happened 23 times before. It just so happens that this is the first time that Putin is coming to India since he launched a war in Ukraine. What is significant here is that India is not a signatory of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which means that Putin can travel safely to India without risk of being arrested for the crimes that he's committed in Ukraine. Crucially here, I think a lot of this visit is about symbolism for Putin. He wants to show the world and also the people back home in Russia that he can travel around the world. He is not a that despite the best efforts of the West to isolate him, to sanction him, he can get around. So the scenes that we're looking at on your screens right now and that have been broadcast through today and tomorrow, very important for Putin. For Modi, however, it's quite different. He has to balance this sort of high wire act of hedging bets between Russia and the United States.
Is it also a message to China that India is also a counterbalance in this region for Russia?
I mean, it is to some degree, but not as much in this particular case because Russia and China are extremely close right now. There is no way that Russia could continue the war in Ukraine without clear support from China in a military sense. And of course, because of purchases of Russian crude. India is different in this regard. I mean, of course, it does buy Russian military hardware, but Russia's not depending on India to survive. And it's worth keeping in mind that in the last few weeks, India has dramatically reduced its purchases of Russian crude. Reliance Industries, of course, has stepped back from some of its private sector purchases as well. And all of that is because of pressure from the United States as President Trump tries to bear down on Putin and impose more pain on the Russian economy as a way of having a bit of leverage in these negotiations with Ukraine.
What do you think Donald Trump would be thinking right now when he looks at these pictures of especially the Russian president riding along with Mr. Modi in his vehicle?
I wouldn't make too much of this because remember, just a few months ago, Putin was in the United States, in Alaska, riding in the Beast, in President Trump's car, the president's car. And, so those images, which were seen around the world, and people like me and many others criticized the White House for hosting President Putin in the way that it did without really leading to any massive breakthroughs in negotiations over Ukraine. So if the American president could do that, I see no reason why the Indian prime minister can't do that. Each country is allowed to do as it pleases. I think the bigger takeaway from this really is that we're entering a world in which the United States is no longer the sole hegemon. A world in which many countries like India, we call them middle powers in academia, there are countries that feel that they need to hedge their bets, that they can't rely just on America or just on the West, and they need to have multi-aligned relations with many other countries. India has long actually tried to do that and must be feeling vindicated to a degree in having that kind of setup in its foreign policy. However, there are limits to this. You can't be everyone's friend and expect that to not collide at some point. And the era we're entering of war, basically several wars on multiple continents, means that geopolitical choices are more likely to collide today than they were 3, 4, 5 years ago.
How do you suspect? Collide how for India?
collide because for the last 25 years, India has been trying to move closer and closer to the United States while maintaining a close friendship with Russia. That collided when Russia invaded Ukraine and the United States wanted to put a lot of pressure and sanctions on Russia, and it expected India to go along with the pressure campaign. India did not. But India could not continue that sort of independent policy indefinitely without some consequences. The consequences are the tariffs, the American tariffs on India this year, which in many ways have derailed a 25-year trend of the United States and India moving closer together. So that is the collision I'm describing, where you can have a foreign policy that, you know, is a la carte, picks and chooses your friends, but in a world in which there is conflict, that becomes much harder to do.
But isn't this visit supposed to offset exactly that collision?
To some degree. But remember, India is still reducing its purchases of Russian oil. Again, there's a lot of symbolism here for both the Indian domestic audience, for the Russian audience, also for a global audience. But ultimately, you know, India's reality remains the same. It needs cheap oil. It is going to have to find it somewhere. Longer term, the bet that India needs to make is still one in which the United States is the world's biggest economy. The United States still has dominance in key areas of technology, whether it's AI, whether it's semiconductors, whether it's cloud computing. Russia is not an economy of the future. Let's be clear. Yes, it has hydrocarbons and fossil fuels, but longer term, India is going to have to figure out a way to work with the United States. Of course, the United States itself is not static. President Trump has been a huge disruptor to the system, but you can imagine that 3 years from now or 8 years from now, there could be a change. And India needs to keep some of its options open, but it can't write off the United States either.
But Russia disagrees with that. Their view is that right now, economically, they are far more trustworthy, far more sturdy than at least Europe, if not America.
Look, trustworthy in that the Russia-India relationship has indeed stood the test of time. From a Russian perspective, I get that. From an Indian perspective, I understand the loyalty. However, India must ask itself, is Russia an economy of the future? And look, part of the reason why the Russian economy hasn't entirely collapsed in the last 3 years is that it has transformed itself into a wartime economy. So a lot of its investments are going into defense infrastructure, into arms production, into arms sales. It has, of course, doubled down on fossil fuels. But again, these are not longer term things that are going to work out well for Russia. In the longer term, when this war eventually ends, Russia may still be relatively siloed from the rest of the global economy. It can't only depend on China and India to some degree. There are lots of problems there that could make Russia an unstable partner in the future. Remember, Putin won't stay in power forever, and he has been an incredibly repressive leader. He has thrown people into a meat grinder of a war with not much care for domestic human rights. At some point, that is going to catch up with Russia. And so if you are looking to deal with Russia, you don't want to ignore that.
All right. For now, thanks very much, Ravi Agarwal. It'll be interesting to see over the next 24 hours the reactions. More importantly, what is the outcome of the meetings that we'll have here and how the world and America in particular reacts. For joining us with your perspective from Washington, Ravi Agarwal, it's been a pleasure.